Before we begin our hearings this morning, Chairman Hamilton joins me in this sad duty to report that William Casey, former Director of Central Intelligence, died this morning. In the coming weeks, as our inquiry unfolds, Mr. Casey's name will be heard frequently in regard to the Iran-Contra affair. Whatever may be the final judgment of his role in this event, it should not obscure Mr. Casey's distinguished record of commitment to this country. From the Office of Strategic Services to the Securities and Exchange Commission to the Central Intelligence Agency, Mr. Casey served his nation with dedication, purpose, and energy. The record will show that once again we have Mr. Thomas Grain accompanying our witness, Mr. Secord. Mr. Secord, this is to remind you that you're still under the oath. Mr. Niels, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, I would request that the first four exhibits marked numbers 1 through 4, be made a part of the record of this hearing. Mr. Secord, before we get back to the story, you testified yesterday that the Lake Resources account received a deposit of $1 million in November of 1985. You indicated that that was happened several days after you arrived in Portugal, and that it was advance payment of transportation expenses. I think you also indicated that it was not part of your job to take care of transportation until several days after you arrived in Lisbon. We have reviewed the bank records provided by Mr. Hakim, and they reflect that the $1 million was deposited on November the 20th, which you had testified yesterday was the day on which you arrived in Portugal. Can you give us any explanation of that?
Yes, Mr. Niels, my recollection was, as I testified yesterday, it's of course possible that the matter of transportation was discussed a few days earlier than that in my initial discussions with Oliver North. I don't recall it, but it's possible that that could have occurred, and North could have been in touch with Mr. Schwimmer a few days earlier than I recalled. I don't have any records of that time frame.
Mr. Secord, yesterday you had just finished telling us about a transaction in which, while you were in Portugal, you arranged for the transportation of 80 Hawk missiles from Tel Aviv to Tehran. They were to go 18 approximately per plane, and that there were to be 4 or 5 plane loads. I think you also testified that after the first plane containing 18 Hawk missiles arrived in Tehran, the Iranians, or so you heard, indicated that they were the wrong type of weapons and they didn't want any more. And that you then went to Israel to do an investigation and find out what had happened. And I think you told us that when you got there, you learned from the Israelis that the Iranians had wanted missiles that would shoot down high-flying planes, and that these Hawk missiles were built for low-flying planes or lower-flying planes.
That's correct.
Before we go on with the story, I'd like to ask you who in the United States government was aware, to your knowledge, that Hawk missiles were being shipped to Iran in November of 1985?
Mr. McFarland, so I was informed by Oliver North, was aware. Oliver North, of course, was aware. Certain officials in the Central Intelligence Agency became aware. I know this because they were communicating with their field office in Portugal, and I personally informed a senior CIA official in Lisbon of the nature of the cargo. I don't know whether he knew that in advance or not, because of course I didn't see their cable traffic. But I would be certain that he reported that back to his headquarters.
Anyone else?
I don't believe that there are any others that I was aware of.
I take it you're including Mr. North.
Yes, of course.
When you were in Israel, did you learn anything else when you had your meetings with Israeli officials?
There was one other issue that was raised by the Israelis during my discussions with them in the Ministry of Defense. That was the issue of previous delivery of 508 TOW missiles from Israel to Iran. They assumed that I knew of this earlier delivery, which took place, I believe, in August and September in 2 tranches, 100 and 400. But in fact, I did not know of this, so this was news to me. The reason why the issue was raised with me was because the Israeli officials in the Ministry of Defense knew that I was very knowledgeable of the U.S. Rules, regulations, and laws with respect to foreign military sales. They told me that they had been assured that these 508 missiles would be replenished by the United States, which didn't particularly surprise me, but what did bother me was the assertion that Mr. McFarlane had assured them that these would be replenished free of charge. In other words, the Israelis were not expected to pay for these missiles through the normal foreign military sales channels. I told the Director General of Ministry of Defense that I believed that he had a communications problem, because I knew, of course, there was no statutory authority for such a move. And I was not thinking of the CIA channel at that time. I was thinking of the normal foreign military sales channel. I suggested that that the way to handle it was to reprogram their existing foreign military sales credits and procure those items through their U.S. procurement office in the normal fashion. They said no, that was not the case at all, that I was wrong, that in fact they had been assured that these missiles would be replenished free of charge. I said replenishment can mean different things, and I really believe that you're wrong. You should talk to Bud McFarlane about this. We left it at that. I later reported this to North and to Mr. McFarlane personally.
Before we get to that, Mr. Secord, what did you do after you'd had these conversations with the Israelis in which you found out what the problem was with the Hawk missiles? Did you report back to your people in Washington?
Yes, I reported this back to North, and both he and the Israelis suggested that I go on from Israel to Europe to meet with Mr. Ghorbanifar, whom I had never met before.
Now, Mr. Secord, at this point in time, I take it there are now 18 Hawk missiles in Tehran, which the Iranians don't want.
That is correct.
The hostages have not been released.
Correct.
How about money? Has any money passed hands to your knowledge at this point in time?
I was told that substantial sums of money were transferred from Ghorbanifar to Mr. Schwimmer's company. I didn't know the amounts of money. It was strictly an Israeli transaction. I did not know how much money was involved. I was advised by the Ministry of Defense, however, that they had received no money as of that time for these TOW missiles.
What is to your knowledge, what is the status at this point in time when you go to Paris? What is the status of the project? Is it dead? Is it in limbo? Is it going to move forward?
I didn't know. Your word limbo probably best characterizes it. It was not clear to me whether it was dead or not. The Iranians were very, very unhappy with these missiles being there, and they wanted them out. That was all that I knew for sure.
In any event, you went to Paris and you had a meeting.
Yes.
Who did you meet with?
I met with Mr. Ghorbanifar, and he was accompanied by Yaakov Nimrodi, an Israeli citizen. I met with them in Paris.
What was Mr. Nimrodi's role?
Mr. Nimrodi was an associate, a business associate of Mr. Al Schwimmer.
Did you talk about what had happened, or did you talk about what was going to happen?
We talked about what had happened, and Ghorbanifar engaged me in quite a bit of conversation about how he thought the game should continue in the future. He had a number of proposals in mind which were interesting. I took notes on these and later, of course, reported the essence of my discussions with Ghorbanifar to North. I was in no position to negotiate any kind of deal with Ghorbanifar or with anyone else, so I was basically in a receive mode.
What were Mr. Ghorbaniffar's proposals?
His proposals all were various sets of arms for hostage proposals. He was very interested in what I would characterize as U.S. high-technology weapon systems, specifically Phoenix missile systems for their F-14s, Harpoon missiles, other air intercept missiles were mentioned a few times, and tow missiles. And even though the IHawk missiles were sitting on the ground in Iran and he knew that they were not wanted, he still talked from time to time about shipping IHawk missiles. He came up with different formulas, so many Phoenixes for so many boxes, as he called them, which was his code word for hostages. It was blatantly a set of proposals of arms for hostages. He had a boilerplate kind of salesmanship patter, which he put out very glibly, which talked about the strategic setting and things that he knew Americans would like to hear. The Russian threat, the Iranians were being held hostage by the hostages and themselves and so on. They needed to move on. But it was my impression that Ghorbanifar was more interested in business than he was in foreign policy.
Did you reach any kind of an agreement during these meetings?
No, and I was not in a position. The only agreement we reached was an agreement to meet in London because I was reporting back to North, and I was informed that they had agreed with the Israelis to meet in London, they, North, and later it turned out that Mr. McFarlane came to London as well.
What was the approximate date of the meeting in Paris?
It would the first week of December.
And did you go to a meeting in London?
Yes. I had some other business to see to in Paris for a day or two, and then traveled to London to meet with the Israelis and Mr. Ghorbanifar. And the approximate date, my recollection of that day was probably about the 6th or so of December that I went to London.
Who did you meet with?
And I met again with Mr. Nimrodi, Mr. Ghorbanifar. Mr. Schwimmer had come up from Israel by this time, and he was in the meetings. And Mr. Kimke also arrived in London for the meetings.
Where did the meeting take place?
It took place in Nimrodi's townhouse near Hyde Park in London.
I take it this is a meeting at which Mr. North and Mr. McFarlane were not present.
That's correct. I talked with all these people the day before North arrived and talked about a possible agenda, although no agenda was ever written out or agreed to. We just talked about how the meeting should be approached. I did not know at the time that Mr. McFarlane was coming. I think I was notified by North after he arrived.
After who arrived?
after North arrived in London.
Before we get to North's arrival, what happened at the meeting with the Israelis and Ghorbanifar?
Again, we went over briefly what had happened, what the probable problem was, and then listened to Ghorbanifar and Nimrodi. Nimrodi was actively engaged in this. Talk about how one could proceed in the future. I mean, they were getting themselves prepared to talk with North, the U.S. official, and they wanted to proceed. They wanted to keep the game going. They wanted to continue in their dealings with Iran, and they were seeking ways in which they could continue. Therefore, several different ideas were tossed around. Again, though, they always revolved around these high technology systems, which only the United States could supply. Now, of course, Israel could supply tows, but Israel doesn't have harpoons. Israel does not have Phoenix missiles. So it would require direct involvement of the United States. I didn't have any power to negotiate anything, but I wasn't hesitant to inform those people that it was my judgment that there was very little chance that the United States would agree to transfer anything as sensitive as a Phoenix or a Harpoon missile to Iran. I couldn't see how that could ever happen. So I advised them of that, but they still kept it in their heads, and they did bring it up at the meetings.
Take it you were there at the request of Mr. North.
Yes.
And what was the purpose? What was the purpose for you being there?
I think he wanted me to collect all the information that I could in advance of the meeting, advise him on what their positions were, and I did this.
I take it a day or so later, Mr. North arrived.
Yes, and I would put that at approximately the 6th or 7th of December he arrived.
And did you report to him?
I did.
And was there a separate meeting between Mr. North and Ghorbanifar and the Israelis before Mr. McFarlane arrived?
Not to my recollection. I don't think that North met with them until McFarlane arrived. He was waiting he was collecting information, preparing for Mr. McFarlane to arrive, and he informed me that Mr. McFarlane himself was coming.
And did Mr. McFarlane, in fact, come?
Yes, he did. He arrived. He arrived, I believe, on the about the 8th of December in the morning. He came by U.S. Air Force Special Mission aircraft. We met in the hotel near Hyde Park. North conferred with him privately for a while, and then I met with Mr. McFarlane and gave him a rehash of what I'd been reporting to North to prepare him for the meeting. We then proceeded to the meeting, and I believe it was early afternoon that the meeting started. That's my recollection, at least. Mr. McFarlane and I and Ollie North went to the meeting together by taxi cab and met with all the others that I've mentioned earlier. Upon arrival, McFarlane and Kimke conferred privately for a short time, and there was a bit of a dispute that erupted out of his hearing amongst several of the Israelis. It was pretty interesting as to who was essentially to be in control, whether it was to be Schwimmer or a general who had come down from the Ministry of Defense. But then McFarlane came.
How did that work out?
Well, it worked out with Schwimmer asserting that he was in control, and rather than continue the dispute in front of Americans, they calmed it down, and it did not become an issue. It was a silly issue to begin with because the ensuing discussions were entirely between McFarlane, Ghorbanifar, and Mr. Kimke occasionally commented.
Would you describe the discussions?
Briefly, yes. The meeting went on for quite a long while, several hours, and it was badly cited, I may say. because they had Mr. McFarland seated at a table smaller than this, directly across from Mr. Ghorbanifar. I mean, they were practically nose to nose throughout this entire session. And then the rest of us were seated around the room, essentially listening. McFarland said that he was there to listen to what had happened and to listen to any proposals that they might have. Ghorbanifar ran through, again, the whole litany of things that I have mentioned to you here today. He started out with his overview, his strategic setting. He had, as I said, it was very good. I've heard him make that address several times. He almost has it like a tape. And he, but very quickly, that meeting degenerated. It degenerated into propositions of U.S. arms for U.S. hostages in Lebanon. Ghorbanifar pursued that line with Mr. McFarland for a long time, far too long. I was glad when the meeting was over, and McFarland was very unhappy, very, very unhappy with this session. He told me...
Are you now referring to something that happened after the meeting?
Yes, he told me after the meeting that he was very unhappy. But it was apparent in the meeting itself. I mean, no U.S. Official could agree to such a proposition. And
what did he say at the meeting?
he said he would report this information back to the president. He committed to nothing. He didn't say he would do anything or wouldn't do anything. He just left.
How long did the meeting last?
It lasted several hours, maybe 3-4 hours. I don't remember. It was too long. It just went on, and Ghorbanifar was making his best salesman pitch.
What did you do after the meeting?
Taxi back to the hotel, picked up the bags, and went straight to the London airport, whereupon we all departed for Washington Andrews Air Force Base in the U.S. Air Force plane. The three of us came back that night together, and so I had opportunity to toss this around with Mr. McFarland and with Colonel North on the way home, and we conferred quite a bit.
What did you say? What did they say?
Well, McFarland said that this was one of the most despicable characters he'd ever met. I found that kind of an interesting comment because he was far from the most despicable character I've ever met, but he, in the...
Let's make sure we know who we're talking about.
Mr. Ghorbanifar was the subject.
Was Mr. Ghorbanifar, if not the most despicable character you've ever met, nonetheless despicable?
The argumentation he was advancing was repulsive to all of us. There's no question about that. But Ghorbanifar is smooth, and he's a salesman, and I mean he was on the wrong line, but he was making a hard pitch, and he had a lot of tenacity, and he just wouldn't stop. Ghorbanifar wanted, as I've said twice before, the game to continue. That was his objective. He may have posed as an agent of Iran, but he was really his own agent. He was a businessman. He was interested in making money, and that was it. So I didn't argue with Mr. McFarland on that point. I did, however, sense in my discussions with him that the Iranian initiative was dead. I mean, this seemed to me to be the case. I made a counter-argument with him and wrote a short handwritten point paper for him on the airplane. It was my position then, and it had been for a long time, that we had essentially a blank in our strategic planning for that area. Since the revolution in Iran, we had nothing in Iran. We had no idea of what was going on in Iran. We had no relations with Iran. Yet it was a vitally strategic piece of territory, which is unique in the world. It seemed to me that if we didn't try to do something to regain a measure of influence, or at least relations with Iran, then the Soviets surely would, over time, achieve a powerful sphere of influence there. And where that would lead, no one could tell. In the Defense Department, I wrote papers on this subject. I attended interagency meetings on this subject, and all we ever did, it seemed to me, was wring our hands and say it's a terrible situation. We never did anything.
Did you convince Mr. McFarland with your arguments, oral and written, on the airplane?
No.
Did you talk to Mr. McFarland about anything else on the airplane of note?
I mentioned to McFarland my meetings with the Israelis in Tel Aviv, and I mentioned that to him when I gave him my first briefing in the hotel. But then we talked about it on the way home, and I mentioned to him again the replenishment of the 508 tows, which the Ministry of Defense had brought to my attention. But he wasn't in a mood to talk about those. Those items. He was non-committal, not particularly concerned about it, and so I dropped it.
Did he say anything about, on that plane trip, about the approval or any approval by this country for that transaction, the shipment by the Israelis of the tows?
Yes, I told him in the course of our discussions that I, of course, had not even known there was any tow transaction in August and September, and he told me that he did know of it, of course, and he said, in fact, the President approved it in July of 1985.
Before we leave these tows, had you talked with anyone other than McFarland about the Israeli claim that McFarland had promised to replenish the tows for free?
Oliver North.
When?
When he first arrived in London, and I may even have mentioned it on the telephone, but I don't think in any detail, because it's not the kind of subject you want to talk about on the telephone.
And I take it you told him that the Israelis claimed that there was such a promise and that you thought there was a communication problem?
On many occasions I made that point.
And what was Mr. North's response?
I was hinting to them that was the line that they ought to take, that there was indeed a communications problem, because to me it was a simple problem if the Israelis would reprogram, but it was a big problem if they expected the Defense Department to ship from stocks, because it's not possible.
What did Mr. North say?
He said he would check it out.
Did he ever tell you whether there was a promise to replenish for free?
Yes, but not at this time. It was later, I believe, in January.
What did he tell you then on that subject?
He said that I was wrong, that there was no communications problem, that there had in fact been an assurance given to the Israeli Ministry of Defense that these missiles would be replaced free of charge.
Before we finish this trip home, did you have any understanding as of that time about where the money was for the Hawks that had not been shipped to Iran?
I had a vague understanding because there was some discussion of the money in the margins. I didn't know numbers, but there had been some transactions taking place in Geneva between Iranian officials, among Iranian officials, Ghorbanifar and Mr. Nimrati.
And this you'd heard about at the various meetings that you'd attended?
Yes, in the margins, but I couldn't put any specificity to it.
Had you heard in general that there had been some kind of a refund from the Israelis to Ghorbanifar?
There had been apparently there had been a quick refund of a certain amount of money when the Iranians were rejecting these 18 missiles. And of course the deal was originally for 80 missiles, remember, not for 18.
So your understanding was that Ghorbanifar had originally paid for 80 and that 18 had been shipped, and when they asked that the others not be shipped, there was a refund for the unshipped Hawks.
That was my general understanding of the situation as it stood at that time.
When you got back from London, on the plane with McFarland and North. What was your understanding with respect to this project?
That the project was finished, terminated.
Did you ride home with Oliver North from the airport?
Yes. We got a ride downtown, and then he gave me a lift, dropped me at my house on the way home that night, and we chatted about it a bit, and he too believed that it was finished. And I had no further discussions about this throughout December. The Tower report is incorrect in its statement that I had many meetings later in December on that subject.
Before we pick up, I take it you did have some meetings in January.
Yes, sir.
Before we pick up on those, I want to follow some money for a moment. You testified that you got in November $1 million, the purpose of which was transportation costs. That, I take it, would have covered the 5 shipments which were contemplated at that time, and only one occurred. Does that mean that you spent substantially less than the full $1 million on transportation?
Yes. We spent, I think it was about $130,000 to the 707 operator, and another sum of money for a leased Lear jet. So altogether, less than $200,000 was expended in support of that project.
So more than $800,000, which had been put in by the Israelis, remained in Lake Resources.
That's correct.
What happened to that money?
Well, I assumed that they would ask for their money back, but they didn't. And I discussed this with North also, and later, I believe late December, he told me that they were not going to ask for it back, and we could use it for whatever purpose we wanted. We actually expended it on the Contra project.
Did you and North discuss the fact that you would spend it on the Contra project?
Yes.
Did he indicate where the idea came from to use it for the Contra project?
I think it was his idea.
Did he give any indication that he discussed this with the Israelis?
No. He told me he discussed it with the Israelis, but not as to destination of the funds. So, so Mr. Schwimmer made a contribution.
We'll let that one sink in for a minute. Mr. Secord, I think you've said that there came a time in January when you did have some further discussions on the subject of Iran.
Yes, sir.
I take it actually there was that one brief meeting in December with the Director Casey, in which he was talking about Iran and you were talking about Nicaragua. Other than that, I take it you had no discussions with anyone after you got off that plane in December?
No.
Until January?
That's correct.
Okay, tell us what happened in January.
Well, I thought, as I said, I thought that the project was finished, aborted, and I didn't even think about it. But in early January, I received a call, and this, I can't put a date on it, but it was just for illustrative purposes, let's say maybe around the 10th or 12th, 13th, somewhere along in there of January. I received a call from Admiral Poindexter. I was asked if I could drop by, and I did that evening.
What was Admiral Poindexter's position at that time?
He was the newly appointed National Security Advisor.
He had replaced Mr. McFarland.
He had replaced Mr. McFarland, I believe, on starting the 1st of January. I went to his office in the White House and spent some time with him that evening. The meeting probably lasted 45 minutes or an hour, but he was interrupted a number of times by phone calls. He had his aide, Commander Thompson, with him, who was in and out of the meeting from time to time. Admiral Poindexter thanked me. He said he was very appreciative for the service I had rendered and for what I was doing. He, of course, was making reference to both the Contra project and to the short trip I had taken Portugal, Israel, Europe in November and December. He said that they had been in touch with the Israeli officials again, that the President had decided to try a new initiative toward Iran. He wanted to know if I would be willing to help them in executing this initiative. He said they had been impressed by what I had done earlier when I'd run my short inquiry on the hawk problem. And I said to him at the time that this thing had appeared to be, from Ghorbanifr's presentation, a swap of American arms for American hostages in Lebanon, and you know, that to me was not acceptable, and I thought he knew that. And he said that this was an entirely new initiative, and he explained it to me, and I'll hit those points in just a second. And he said that this was not going to be, and he agreed with me, we couldn't live with arms for a hostage swap. This was not going to be one. This initiative was founded on strategic objectives, which were basically to achieve some sort of dialogue with the Iranian government, to make contact with so-called, so-called moderate elements, or what I call the pragmatic elements in the Iranian government, and to press forward with this initiative in a covert way in an attempt to make a breakthrough. Conventional methods had not yielded anything, and hopefully to persuade the Iranians to use their influence to release the hostages being held by Shia factions in Lebanon. I said I would be honored to try to do what I could, and that pretty well summarizes the meeting that took place that night.
You've indicated that he said it was not going to be arms for hostages. Hostages were mentioned, I take it.
Indeed. They were mentioned several times, and there's no secret there was great concern in the White House about these hostages. Many avenues had been pursued to try to get them released, and there's no question, I don't want anybody to misunderstand me, there's no question that the hostages were an important element in this initiative. No question at all.
Were arms mentioned?
Yes.
What was said about arms?
Specific arms were not discussed at this meeting, whether it be tows or this or that, but he said that they were convinced that small amounts of arms could be used successfully as bona fides in this initiative.
What was it that...
I agreed, by the way.
What was it that you were being asked to do?
It wasn't clear at that time. He just asked if I'd be willing to help, and I said yes. And I was shortly invited to another meeting in which my role became much more clear.
Where was that meeting?
That meeting was also held in the White House in the Situation Room.
Who invited you?
And I was invited by Admiral Poindexter's office. I don't remember whether he told me that night that there was going to be a meeting or I got a phone call a day or two later. But in any case, it was his office which invited me to the meeting.
Who was at the meeting?
At this meeting, which was, I thought, about the 16th of February, but I note that the Tower report has it a few days later. I don't know exactly. At this meeting were the then General Counsel of the CIA, Mr. Sporkin. He had one or two attorneys with him from his office. The Deputy Director of CIA for Operations, Mr. Claire George. The Chief, or the Deputy Chief of the Near East section of CIA was present. And also present were North. I should point out that Mr. North, or Colonel North, was not present in the meeting between Poindexter and I. But North was at the Situation Room meeting. Commander Thompson was in the meeting also.
Is he a lawyer?
He is a lawyer. He's a naval officer, but he's a lawyer.
What was the subject of the meeting?
The subject, I thought the meeting was peculiar because I didn't really know why I was there, because they were discussing the finding. I had been told earlier by Admiral Poindexter there was going to be a finding. Of course, there would have to be if there was going to be a covert operation. And the finding, the presidential finding, the order initiating this covert action was the main subject at this meeting.
Why were you, a private citizen, invited to a meeting with apparently a number of lawyers who were putting together a presidential finding?
Yeah, they had already put the finding together and they were discussing it, and I thought that they were discussing certain language, and later reports indicate that that finding may have already been typed and final at that point. I don't recall, because it was kind of an academic discussion as far as I was concerned.
Well, was it a signed finding you were talking about there, or a draft of a finding?
I don't think the finding was signed when I saw it. I only got a chance to read one paragraph of it, and I don't recall seeing the President's signature on it, which is why I put the meeting on or before the 17th, because it was signed on the 17th.
Was there discussion of changes or possible changes in the finding?
There was a discussion of one change that had been made, in which they inserted into the language that in addition to the normal action agencies, that the government would work through third parties and third countries. And that's why I was at the meeting. I was the third party. I was to be the commercial cutout, if you will. It was their intention to in some respects mirror the previous Israeli operation. The previous Israeli operation dealt from the Israeli government through an Israeli company to an Iranian commercial operator, Ghorbanifar, and then to the government of Iran. And it was in that fashion that the Israelis dealt with the matter.
What was the purpose for a commercial cutout, as you put it?
The governments involved, Israel and the United States, could not deal directly with the government of Iran.
Why not?
Well, they have been unsuccessful in establishing any kind of relations, and they couldn't deal with. I mean, we were the great Satan. There was no way that that the governments could overtly deal one with the other, even if they wanted to at that point.
Was this a legal problem or a public relations problem?
I think it was a public relations problem primarily, and I think that they structured it in that fashion in order to be able to, in a practical way, deal with Iran.
Were there legal issues that were discussed at this meeting?
Yes. Whether or not to notify the Congress and how it would be done, or when it would be done. It was discussed that there was legal precedent for delaying notification. I was at the time not very familiar with the laws pertaining to the Central Intelligence Agency, since I'd never dealt with those when I was in the Pentagon. So I was simply a listener at that point. Additionally, it was decided that the United States, and this was a very important point, the United States would have to directly ship the weapons rather than taking them from Israeli stocks. And they decided that they would have to do this because of the various statutes that apply to the sale of arms. And it was decided by the lawyers that the Economy Act would have to be utilized, whereby one agency in the U.S. government can purchase from another agency. And so the plan was for the CIA to buy the materials from the Defense Department stocks, and then to sell them to my organization, which in turn would sell them to Ghorbanifar, who in turn would sell them to Iran. That was the plan, and that's the way the plan was executed for the first several transactions.
Just to be certain, as the plan was discussed, did the Israelis have any part in it at all?
Yes, it was a joint venture, if you will. The Israelis were to provide the base from which to ship, a secure base, and they were also to provide cover. It was planned that part of the cover for this operation would be that if it were discovered that the Israelis could take the hit, if you will.
Were the sales to go through Israel in any way? In other words, was Israel at any time going to take possession and ownership of the arms?
No.
Was that a change from some previous plan?
Yes, it was. Previously, it appeared they had discussed a plan with the Israelis whereby the Israelis would, in fact, either ship from their own inventories and later to be replenished from U.S. inventories, or would buy from the U.S. and then reship. That was originally the plan, but they abandoned that plan for whatever reasons the lawyers had and came up with a new plan.
Just so we understand the role of the commercial cutout, which I think you have described as being yours, is that correct?
Correct.
I think you indicated that neither Israel nor the United States could sell directly to Iran. And I think you said that that wasn't a legal problem, it was some other kind of problem. Precisely from whom was this plan designed to keep the fact that the United States would be selling to Iran?
From whom?
Well,
who was involved in the planning?
No, let me reframe it. I take it both the United States and officials in Iran knew that the United States was selling arms to Iran.
Right.
Okay. The commercial cutout was designed in order to conceal that fact.
Yes.
From whom?
From the Iranians.
Anyone else?
No.
How about the Congress?
If that was intended, it was never discussed in my presence. I don't think that was their plan. I think that they were interested in concealing it from Iran only.
Now, when you say Iran, there were government officials in Iran who were, of course, aware.
Very few, but there were some, and it was a very delicate matter for these people.
And there were a few government officials in the United States who were aware.
Yes.
Now, was the commercial cutout in part designed to make sure that only a small number of people in the United States were aware?
Possibly, but I hadn't considered that point before you just now raised it. It's possible.
How about in the case of Israel? You said it was designed to mirror the way it had been handled previously in Israel. For what purpose was the commercial cutout devised in the transactions between Israel and Iran?
Clearly, to enable the Israelis to deal with Iran. It's even more difficult for the Israelis to deal with Iran than for the United States. There could be no hint officially that Israel was dealing with Iran, and therefore they had to form a commercial relationship.
You're saying, I take it, that the fact that Israel was selling to Iran had to be concealed from Iranians?
Yes.
How about from Israelis?
I don't think that entered into their calculus, but I can't speak for them. I can only tell you what I believe.
Staying on the subject of the commercial cutout, was it part of the purpose of the commercial cutout to create profit for the commercial enterprise?
We did not go into this enterprise. I did not go into this enterprise with the notion of making profit. As time went on, we...
Right now, I'm just asking, we'll get back to what happened later, but right now I'm just asking about the purpose at the time for including a commercial cutout.
There was no intention of profiteering. I know that some people are tossing this word around right now, and I resent it. There was no intention of profiteering, none.
Was there any discussion of profit?
No.
Any discussion of markup?
There was a lot of discussion about markup because in order to make it work, I had to mark up the prices in order to pay for all the overhead involved.
I'm talking now about the meeting that you had in which you were discussing the finding and discussing the way the transaction would be structured.
There was no discussion of that.
I take it you're saying that there were later discussions of markup in the context, among other things, of covering your expenses.
That's correct.
And I take it what you're saying is that the commercial enterprise not only paid a purchase price for the arms, but also had to pay expenses involved in transporting them and delivering them.
That's correct.
I take it that either explicitly or implicitly at this meeting at which the finding was discussed, that you agreed to serve as a commercial cutout.
That is correct. I did not feel that I was a part of the government in any way, that it was clearly a commercial operation.
And I take it there were some transactions which followed.
Yes, sir.
And I take it you had some meetings in which those transactions were discussed and agreed upon.
That's correct.
What was the next meeting after the one in which you discussed the finding?
Well, there were several meetings that I was involved in with, first with Colonel North and then later with some logistics officials and some operational officials from the CIA. I was informed subsequent to this meeting in the Situation Room that I've described for you that a new Israeli official had been appointed to be in charge of this operation.
Who was that?
This man, it was Amram Nir from the Prime Minister's office in Israel. I was told that in very early January, Mr. Nir had come to Washington, held discussions with Colonel North and with John Poindexter, and also with Mr. McFarlane.
Who informed you of this?
Colonel North. He was reading me into the situation after this meeting in the Situation Room.
Would it be fair to say that from then on, Mr. North was your principal contact in the United States government?
Indeed. I was also told that in January, around the 11th to the 13th of January, Mr. Ghorbanifar had been invited to come to Washington, although I didn't see him, and he was given a polygraph exam, which, as usual, he
Did you eventually nonetheless have a meeting with Mr. Ghorbanifar and others in London in January?
Yes, indeed.
And would that be the 22nd and 23rd of January?
That's correct.
1986?
Yes.
Prior to that time, had you been made aware of any negotiations with the Iranians in furtherance of this initiative?
I'd been made aware that there were discussions between North and Ghorbanifar when he was here in Washington, that there had been a lot of discussions between North and Nir on the telephone, but other than that, I don't know of any negotiations.
Were you aware that during those negotiations arms had been discussed?
Yes.
Were you aware of the type?
By this time, I was told that it had been decided and authorized by the President that 4,000 TOW missiles would be available for this initiative.
Just briefly for the record, what is a TOW missile?
A TOW missile is a wire-guided missile principally for anti-tank type work.
Were you told that there had been any discussions of price?
Yes, I was. I was told that when Ghorbanifar was here for his polygraph test that he had suggested that the price for the TOWs, and he'd been told that TOWs were going to be involved, that the price for the TOWs should be $10,500 per TOW, that his profit would be $500 per TOW, so he said. Although we had evidence, I learned later that he probably charged far more than that in the earlier transactions. He said that this should be the price because this was the price he charged during the Israeli transactions in August and September 1985.
Was he the one who mentioned this price, or was this or was it North or someone from this side?
I was told by North that Ghorbanifar brought it up, and Nir later confirmed that to me, because he had talked to Ghorbanifar also.
So he had offered a price of $10,000 sometime before your meeting in London.
Yes.
And had you been told that there had been any discussion of hostages?
Yes, there were always discussions of hostages whenever there were meetings with Ghorbanifar or the Iranians.
And what was your understanding of the agreement so far as it related to hostages or the status of the negotiations on that subject?
Yet to be defined.
Who attended the meeting in London?
I attended the meeting in London, Oliver North, Amram Nir, and Mr. Ghorbanifar.
What was discussed there?
At this time, Ghorbanifar raised the subject in front of North and I with Nir that he was still owed $5.4 million.
What was that for?
This was had to do with the IHawk transaction. Remember, the Hawks are still sitting in Tehran. The Iranians are still demanding that they be removed. He raised this with Nir in front of us because he hoped to get some kind of support from us in this dispute with Mr. Nir.
Did he?
No.
What else happened at the Did Mr. Nir agree to return the money?
He said that they were working on it. I later learned that they did return the money.
And just, although this is out of sequence, do you also know whether the 18 missiles were returned?
Yes, they were returned in our first transaction with Iran, and I cover that in February.
What else occurred at this meeting?
Well, several things. At this meeting, the Israeli representative demanded that their 508 TOW problem be solved. He wanted to know how it was going to be solved. That is, how were we going to furnish them with 508 TOWs without Israel having to pay for them?
This was an issue between the Israelis and the Americans only, I take it.
That's correct.
All right, what happened about that?
It was not mentioned in Ghorbanifar presence. Well, this was an issue that Israel wanted an assurance on from North, and so it was decided that sufficient monies would be collected in the sale of these 4,000 TOWs to enable me to purchase 4,508 TOWs. Thus, we were going to collect sufficient funds along the way to offset the purchase of these weapons for Israel.
Returning to the transaction between the Americans and the Iranians, the future transaction, what was said about that?
At this meeting, it was discussed that we would have to get from Iran some sort of plan on how we were to proceed with the initiative, an agreed plan. It was high on the agenda of the American side to achieve a high-level government-to-government meeting with Iranian officials. Ghorbanifar is not an Iranian official. Ghorbanifar took this request and said that he would pursue it with his contact in the office of the Prime Minister in Israel. I also passed the Lake Resources account number and address to Mr. Neer at this first meeting. This was the first time I met Mr. Neer. We did not settle the price finally at this meeting, although we talked about the price being $10 million. This is what Ghorbanifar had offered, and this is what I wanted to collect. I had not yet priced out my operation. There was an awful lot of uncertainty in this operation at this time. We went back to...
What was said about hostages at the meeting?
It was discussed that the hostages was an issue that we had to get around and get past. Ghorbanifar used his line that Iran too wanted to settle this problem because Iran was being held hostage by the hostages. But there were no, I don't recall any specific plan being arrived at this meeting.
Was a plan arrived at some time later between the Americans and the Iranians?
Yes, it was.
When?
On the 6th, we agreed to meet again. That's about all we really agreed to at this first meeting in London. We agreed to meet again after having vetted some of the problems. On the 6th of February, we were supposed to meet again in London. North and I both traveled there, and so did Mr. Neer, but Mr. Ghorbanifar did not show.
Did there come a later time when you reached an agreement with the Iranians?
Yes, but this was done by telephone between Neer, Ghorbanifar, and North.
And I take it was reported to you?
Yes, it was. I was kept advised, I think, completely.
And would this have been in the next week or so after the meeting that was supposed to take place?
It was shortly after. Neer stayed behind in London trying to locate Ghorbanifar. North and I returned home, and Neer did locate Ghorbanifar. And it was normal of Ghorbanifar, we found a normal pattern for him. If he had problems, he would be a no-show. I mean, he would disappear, go off the scope whenever he had problems. So we could tell when he had problems. We just couldn't contact him. Whenever he thought he had a problem solved, then of course he'd be back up on the loop again, and we'd be back in touch with him. I was in touch with Ghorbanifar on a couple of occasions in February by telephone, and we, on one of these occasions, I kind of burned my bridges with Mr. Ghorbanifar because I was very angry with him. He had made a deposit to the Credit Suisse Bank, which bounced. And of course we couldn't move. We didn't have 1 cent of U.S. government money in this operation, never. And we couldn't move without cash in advance because the whole process was stalled without money because the CIA had to have money in advance. They would not float this with their money. The Defense Department had to have money in advance and so on.
Just before you get off that, I take it what you're saying is that until you had the money from the Iranians put in Lake Resources, and out of that money paid to the U.S. government the price that it was charging for the military hardware stayed in U.S. government stocks.
Yes, and no moves were made, even preliminary moves could be made until the money was in the system.
Getting back to Ghorbanifar, I think you were about to tell us.
I was having a rather acid conversation with Mr. Ghorbanifar on the telephone, and I told him that I thought that he had behaved very poorly, that he was promising the moon always and never producing, and that I was going to recommend that he be terminated. Now he misinterpreted that, and he I don't mean that to be funny. But he took it the wrong way, and he told Mr. Neer that I was trying to have him killed. I think I even said later, not a bad idea, but it's not what I had in mind. From this time onward, I was complaining, and so were my colleagues, about the Ghorbanifar connection. It seemed to me to be too fraught with problems. It was just a big operational security problem, and it was a very inefficient connection and a very indefinite connection. Nonetheless,
So Secord will return to that, but let's get back to the transaction that was being negotiated. I take it you learned shortly after the 6th of February that an agreement had been made. Is
yes,
that correct?
And the agreement was that the Iranians would meet face-to-face with U.S. government officials in Europe, and that they would do so after 500 tows were delivered, and the first transaction was to involve 1,000 tows. So the plan was to deliver 500 tows as a sign of our willingness and good faith, and then to have the meeting in Europe, and then if the meeting were judged to be a successful meeting, to deliver the balance of the first 1,000 tows, another 500.
Now,
And so this was
I take it the meeting
plan.
in Europe was not simply a meeting with Ghorbanifar, but was a meeting with some other people.
Yes, I'd like to discuss that now if it's the right time.
It's not quite the right time yet, but I
Okay.
take it that these were Iranian government officials.
That is correct.
What was agreed to about on the subject of hostages, if anything?
There was no agreement on hostages for this transaction. The subject of hostages was one of the agenda items to be taken up at the European meeting.
What was the price for the tows?
The price we charged for the tows was $10 million for 1,000 tows, and Ghorbanifar finally deposited that amount of money to the Lake Resources account.
And then out of that money, you pay the U.S. government?
Yes.
And how did you do that?
We transferred the money to the U.S. government to an account that the agency gave us in Switzerland.
Before getting into the meeting in Frankfurt, I take it that the tows were in fact shipped after the money had been received into Lake Resources account and the government paid.
Yes, we started moving the tows out of Texas on the 19th of February, 1986.
Did you move them all at the same time?
Yes, we moved all 1,000 tows on 2 Southern Air Transport 707 aircraft to Israel. And then beginning, I think, about the 22nd or so of February, we transferred the first 500 tows to Tehran.
How was that done?
And this was done in a secret way via an Israeli 707 aircraft, which had been sterilized, that is, all markings removed from it, and it was chartered by me. I agreed to pay the Israeli government a price for the use of the airplane, and I had to furnish the crew.
And where did the crew come from?
And the crew came from Southern Air Transport. We actually had 2 crews that were used. They were specially selected from their pilots, and they were screened by me. And if there are any heroes in this story, it's got to be them. They were tremendous. They were fantastic. They were professional, and they pulled it off beautifully.
How did they actually go?
They
to
went
Tehran?
by a route that I had devised so as to keep them out of any other country's airspace. It turned out that with the loads that we were carrying, we could just barely fly a very long route down the Red Sea in international airspace around the southern end of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, and then up into the Sea of Oman and coast into Iran just east of the port of Bandar Abbas. We computed that with good weather, we could make it safely, pretty safely, to Bandar Abbas. Of course, planning a route like this on paper and actually flying it sometimes two different things. Your fuel flow specifics have to be proved, but we were fairly confident that we could do it safely. And we also devised a covert command control communication system whereby I could control these missions from my from my command post in Israel.
And is that where you were during these flights?
Yes, and there have been a lot of reports, even this morning in the news, that I flew to Tehran. I never went to Tehran. I did not fly to Tehran.
Did this first shipment of 500 tows down the Red Sea and into Iran go smoothly?
Yes, it went very smoothly. The weather was not bad, and they landed at the airfield in Bandar Abbas on the southern coast of Iran and discharged the 500 tows, offloaded them there, and then flew empty to Tehran, where they onloaded. They were supposed to onload the 18 Hawks that had been sitting there all this time. There were only 17 Hawks provided to them. They claimed that they had torn down the 18th when looking for something special. But of course, there was nothing special. And therefore, they only returned 17 Hawks. It took almost 12 hours to load those 17 Hawks into the aircraft, and I was in quite a sweat because I was out of contact with them a lot longer than I thought should have been the case. But finally, they came up on the air as they departed Iranian airspace and flew uneventfully back to Tel Aviv and lifted quite a load from my shoulders.
After
so that was uneventful series of flights.
And did the meeting with the Iranian officials then take place a few days thereafter?
Yes, sir. The meeting started, I think, on the 24th or 25th of February. And
where?
In the city of Frankfurt, Germany, at the airport hotel.
Who was there?
And present in this meeting, I flew up from Israel to join the meeting. Present in the meeting were Oliver North, heading the U.S. Delegation, the chief of the Near East section of the Central Intelligence Agency was a member of his delegation. Also present was my partner, Mr. Albert Hakim, and this is a
Tell us how he came to be there.
But he didn't want to be there. He protested about being pressed into service there, but he served as our translator-interpreter. The agency had very few people who were proficient in Farsi language. They apparently had one lady who was pretty good, but we couldn't use a woman in this role with the Iranians. And they just couldn't come up with anyone to fill the bill. So we pressed him into service, and I made a slight mistake. I notified Mr. Neer of his, Mr. Hakim's name as being the U.S. candidate as being the U.S. translator. And he passed this to Ghorbanifar, who took extreme exception. He said that Mr. Hakim was an enemy of the state. This was crazy. He knew this name, and so on and so. I violated one of my own rules. I should have used alias for him in this covert op, and I didn't. For a while, I thought that Hakim could not fulfill this role because of Ghorbanifar objections. But the agency was still unable to come up with a Farsi translator, and I'm not nearly good enough in Farsi to fill that role. And we could not rely on Mr. Ghorbanifar to be our translator. So in the last days before the meeting occurred, I simply told Albert he had to do the job. And so we disguised him. And we
How?
Mr. Hakim has his hair is a little sparse on top, and we bought a wig for him, a gray wig, and put glasses on him, and amazingly, he looked like a totally different man. It was just amazing. Even I couldn't recognize him. And he filled that role in the meeting.
What name did he use?
He used the name Ibrahim, a Turkish, of Turkish descent, who was a contract translator here for the government, and flew.
Was Mr. Neer at the meeting?
Mr. Neer was at the meeting, and of course Ghorbanifar knew who he was, but Mr. Neer was under U.S. cover at the meeting.
Well, will you explain that, under U.S. cover?
We passed him off as an American official for the purposes of that meeting.
By the way, what name were you using and what name was Mr. North using?
North used the name of Mr. Good, and at this meeting I used the name of General Adams. Now, the reason why that was necessary was that they wanted me to present, that is North, and the agency wanted me to present part of the intelligence briefing which was to be given at this meeting. It had been agreed that some representative sample of tactical intelligence information would be briefed to the Iranian delegation, and since it involved a lot of military symbology and order of battle jargon, and since I'm pretty familiar with the Iranians, they asked me if I would fill that role, so I did.
Who was there from the Iranian side?
An official from the office of the Prime Minister of Iran, and he had with him an aide and two colonels that he introduced as being from their military intelligence organization. We believed, however, that one of the colonels actually was from the office of the Prime Minister.
And Mr. Ghorbanifar?
And Mr. Ghorbanifar, yes.
Can you just very briefly describe the meeting?
Yes, the main meeting which took place, I was not present. It was a meeting among the representatives from Iran, along with Ghorbanifar, Oliver North, the CIA official, and of course Hakim acting as translator. These meetings were taped surreptitiously. I was briefed later as to what had transpired, and my understanding was that North went through his talking points, which he had an officially blessed set of talking points. They went through the U.S. Strategic objectives, the U.S. concerns about the Soviet threat in the region, the U.S.'s concern about the continuing Iran-Iraq war and our desire to see an honorable ending to that. What does honorable ending mean? Well, honorable ending means that you can face your people with the solution that you devise, but the killing has to stop. It's destabilizing and so on. This was the U.S. position. The matter of hostages did come up in this meeting, as it always did, but as the tapes would prove, the strategic nature of this initiative occupied most of the discussion. It was not a discussion about swapping arms for hostages, and indeed there were no hostages released, nor were any expected to be released as a part of this February deal.
You feel certain of that there were no hostages expected to be released?
I didn't expect any to be released. I was not informed that there was any plan for any to be released as a result of this initial deal.
In any event, you were not told that any were to be released, and none were.
And none were, and we didn't plan for any to be released.
What was, if anything, what was agreed on for the future?
The U.S. delegation was pleased with the meeting. It was agreed in this meeting that there would be a future high-level meeting between and in the near future between high-level officials of the United States and high-ranking members of the Iranian government, and they were talking in terms of foreign ministries and State Department high officials.
Would it be fair to say, Mr. Secord, that a lot was made at this meeting out of the fact that officials of the two governments were meeting face-to-face for the first time in a long time?
Yes, that was also a big point when the meeting was summed up at the end, that this was the first time that there had been face-to-face discussions between Iranian and U.S. officials since 1981. It was agreed that this future meeting would take place on Kish Island, which is a small island on the south coast of Iran.
Did you have a reaction to that as a location?
Yes, I was very pleased when I learned that Kish was to be the site. I was very pleased with that because I felt that our delegation would be secure there. We have strong forces in the region, and although I thought that our friends in Iran were probably going to deal with us in good faith, one couldn't be too sure, and I was, of course, conditioned by my previous service in trying to release the hostages from Iran in 1980. So I was concerned about the safety of our delegation. Kish was a great place, I thought.
Was a meeting actually agreed upon, or a specific meeting agreed upon, or was it agreed simply to discuss it further in the future?
No, it was agreed that there would be a meeting, but there were no specifics. There was no date set, and the attendees were not named. It was agreed that it would be done as soon as possible, but in the near future.
You mentioned some intelligence. Without getting into the details of its nature, can you tell us what was said and done on the subject of intelligence information?
Yes. This briefing was presented to the two colonels.
This is a briefing by whom?
It was a briefing by me and the chief of Near East section of CIA. The briefing consisted of a small section of the Iran-Iraq border in which details of order of battle were described, and there was one high-altitude photograph that was annotated that was showed to them but not given to them. So this was an example. The purpose of the briefing was to show the type of information that the United States is capable of providing if they have an intelligence exchange agreement.
Following the meeting was the second group of 500 TOW missiles actually shipped.
Yes, the meeting was judged to be successful, and I was asked to deliver the second set of 500 TOWs and placed a call to my crew and who were waiting in Israel, and they delivered the second 500 TOWs to, this time to Tehran uneventfully. We learned that we could fly a little farther than we had originally calculated.
So the TOWs were already in Tel Aviv, and
Yes.
After the meeting they were simply shipped on.
Yes, sir.
Have you, based on your review of the records made available to the committee by Hakim, computed the cost, price received, and expenses related to the 1,000 TOWs that were sold to Iran in February?
Yes, I have.
Could you tell us how much was paid for them into the Lake Resources account?
Yes, $10 million was paid into the Lake Resources account.
How much was paid to the United States government out of the Lake Resources account?
The U.S. government was paid $3.7 million for the TOWs.
That leaves a difference of $6.3 million?
Yes.
And what were the expenses associated with that transaction?
There were expenses of $850,000 that were paid. There were $2 million set aside for self-insurance. Israel demanded that these aircraft be insured for a haul value of $2 million each. So if we used one airplane, we had to have $2 million set aside. If we used two, we had to have $4 million.
These are the Israeli sanitized airplanes that you were using
But Israeli
to transport from Tel Aviv to Tehran.
Yes. You may recall that the reason why the Schwimmer plan broke down was because he couldn't locate any aircraft, and the insurance problem was the reason. So our solution to the insurance problem was to set aside $2 million in this case. Additionally, an amount which was later defined, but not defined then, had to be fenced or set aside to purchase Israeli tows. Remember, I said that we would have to purchase, after the delivery of 4,000 tows, we'd have to purchase another 500 for Israel. Later, that figure was determined to be 822,000, so that was set aside. Thus, if you do the arithmetic, you'll see that we had approximately $2.6 million surplus in our accounts at the end of this transaction, plus a $2 million certificate of deposit.
And I take it once the Israeli airplane had returned back safely, at least for the time being, that $2 million was available to you.
It certainly was available, but we never took it out of the CD for the entire period of the operation because we were always looking forward to the next cycle.
After this transaction, did you have any discussions with Oliver North about how to use this $2.6 million surplus?
Yes.
Would you describe it?
Colonel North's position was consistent throughout in February and later. He wanted me to use all available surpluses to support the Contra project.
Did you have a number of conversations with him?
And that didn't bother me. I was comfortable with that. I had a number of conversations with him about this matter over a period of time. There was always a certain amount of tension on this subject because North wasn't running this operation. I was, along with Hakeem, and of course he wasn't sitting around worrying about having enough money to execute it, because we couldn't be in a position of being forced to go back to Ghorbanifar for money if we had an overrun. I mean, that would have been ridiculous. We could never get away with that. We had to keep sufficient revenues in these accounts to stay fluid so that we could go on to the next operation. And remember, not one dime of U.S. money went into this operation. So we had to be very, very careful on this. And so I was perfectly willing to send funds to the Contra project from these surpluses, and as the bank records, which you got from Mr. Hakeem, show, we did. But never was I able to send as much as Ollie North thought we should.
Mr. Secord, were there further discussions and negotiations thereafter on the subject of the meeting? The
Yes.
meeting between high government officials of each country?
Yes, there were.
And without getting into each individual discussion, how did those discussions develop?
Well, I think there were a lot of discussions by telephone amongst the key players, which were North and Nir and Ghorbanifar, and between Ghorbanifar and his principals in Iran. But there was a very important meeting which took place the 7th or 8th of March. I was not in the meeting, but North, the chief of NE, CIA, and the CIA retired officer who had been recalled for this project, Mr. George Cave, and Ghorbanifar all met in Paris to discuss the upcoming meeting at Kish. At this meeting, Ghorbanifar informed them that he had been informed that Kish was not available. This was no longer an available option. The meeting would have to be in Tehran. I learned of this, of course, after they returned from the meeting. Also, for the first time, Ghorbanifar raised the issue of improved Hawk spare parts, not missiles, but spare parts, as being materials that were now wanted in this initiative, and that the tows were less important, according to him now, that they really wanted the spare parts for the Hawks. At this meeting, not in Ghorbanifar presence, of course, it was also agreed that both sides, the Israeli side and the American side, would commence an active search for new channels of communications with Iran. The Ghorbanifar channel was obviously flawed.
Leaving that aside for the moment, and we will return to it later. Keeping on the subject of the meeting, was a meeting eventually agreed on and arranged in Tehran?
Yes, it eventually was agreed to, and it took place in May, much later than expected.
And who was the American official who attended that meeting?
Mr. McFarlane and Mr. North, Colonel North, and George Cave attended this meeting, along with another official from the NSC staff, Howard Teicher.
Was there any advance trip in anticipation of and in preparation for the meeting that Mr. McFarlane attended?
There was no advance trip.
Was there ever one contemplated?
Yes.
And what happened?
It was strongly recommended by three of us. Near, myself, and North were all recommending that a preparatory meeting take place. There was, after all, as far as I knew, no agenda even agreed to for this meeting, and so it seemed to me, at least, and I think to the others, to be not well organized. In fact, I've been to many international meetings, and I don't think I've ever been to one where there wasn't some preparatory work done in advance. However, the position was taken that there would be no advance preparatory meeting, that the terms and conditions that had been agreed to in Frankfurt were sufficient, and that they would and that the Iranian side would simply have to deal with that. And so there was no advance meeting, and that was a big mistake.
Mr. Secord, was this meeting in some way tied to the Hawk spare parts that Mr. Ghorbanifar had raised at the March meeting?
Yes, it was. And the plan that was finally agreed to, again working through Ghorbanifar, the plan that was finally agreed to was that the plane that the McFarlane delegation came in on would carry a sample of these spare parts, and they did. They carried one of the 13 pallets of IHawk spare parts that were involved, and it was just a sample.
Let's back up a little bit. Mr. Secord, can you tell us some more details about the Ghorbanifar request to purchase spare parts?
Well, he raised this issue in this early March meeting, and then later in March forwarded through NEAR to us a listing of some 240 line items of spare parts that they wanted. They provided the stock numbers from their catalogs, and they were just a hodgepodge of spare parts. Didn't make a lot of sense to me. They included generators, wire bundles, things like this. Things that I was fairly sure they already had, quite frankly. But in any case, that was what they wanted, and so it was this listing that served as the guide to for the CIA to aggregate these parts.
Were you involved in discussions concerning the price that you would charge, or that the U.S. government would charge, for these spare parts?
Yes, I was, and the discussions went on over a several-month period. The delivery was not made until late May, but in March we were trying to price these things. There was a lot of confusion in the system. They couldn't locate all the parts that were wanted initially. The prices changed always upward. We couldn't even determine what the weight of these parts were going to be for quite a long while. So or the volume. I didn't even know how many aircraft it was going to take initially.
Who participated in the discussions of the price that Ghorbanifar would be charged for the Hawk spare parts besides you?
North participated. I think that one of his assistants also listened to us talk about it, Mr. Colonel Earl. And also I discussed it with Near on several occasions.
We'll get into the details later, but I take it it's fair to say that the price that you eventually decided to charge was substantially in excess of the amount of money paid to the U.S. Treasury.
Yes.
Did you and North talk about the reason for this difference?
Yes, of course we did. And there were a number of reasons, and Contra was one of them. The Contra requirement was much on our minds, as I think some of the KL-43 messages have showed you. We were running out of money to support the Contras, so that was on our minds. But additionally, I had in my mind at that time this great concern, this great uncertainty. The prices were rising all the time. I was also informed during this time frame that the earlier transaction had been underpriced by CIA, and they had a $240,000 overrun which had to be paid. I couldn't afford to have an overrun. So that was in my mind. In April, we had to buy a ship. Of course, that became a factor. I didn't even know how many airplanes we were going to have to use initially. That was a factor. I discussed this with Near. I knew that I was going to have to use a minimum of 2 aircraft because the aircraft carrying the delegation had to stay with the party in Tehran. That therefore then meant I had to set aside $4 million for insurance, and this was an Israeli demand. So all of these factors were combined together, and we finally priced the spare parts at $15 million, and that's what Ghorbanifar put in.
When you say that's what Ghorbanifar put in, that means put into Lake Resources, I take it.
Correct.
And that price was agreed by you and North, and that's the price given to Ghorbanifar?
That is correct.
Who actually gave it to Ghorbanifar?
I'm not sure yet, but it appears that he had a financier.
No, I'm sorry. Who told him the price?
Near.
And who told Near the price?
I did.
Now, I think you indicated that one pallet of these spare parts went with Mr. McFarland to Tehran.
Yes.
Was that pursuant to an agreement with the Iranians?
That's what I was told.
And what happened to the rest of the spare parts? Where were they?
They were stored in Israel for later delivery after the Tehran meeting.
So all of the spare parts, after Ghorbanifar put his money into the Lake Resources account, all of the spare parts were transported first to Tel Aviv. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is that by
Southern
Air Transport planes?
Yes.
And you paid for the transportation
and
cost?
I paid for it.
And then all but one pallet were left in Tel Aviv, and the one pallet went in the plane with Mr. McFarland and his group, I take it, to Tehran.
That is correct.
Where were you at the time?
I was in my command post in Tel Aviv.
Prior to Mr. McFarland's trip, had there been, prior to the time his plane actually took off, had there been discussions on the subject of hostages?
Well, there were a lot of discussions. I told you that the hostages were discussed at the Frankfurt meeting. Hostages were discussed with Near and with Ghorbanifar frequently by North and by me. But as far as I know, and this will surprise some people, I guess, but as far as I know, there was no Iranian agreement to produce all the hostages at the time of the meeting in Tehran. I know that this expectation arose somehow. I don't know how exactly that expectation got into McFarland's head. You'll have to ask him. I don't know. But I know of no such agreement. I was surprised to learn that that was one of the negotiating points, one of the sticking points.
And I take it you had been in frequent contact with Mr. North and Mr. Neer in the weeks and days preceding the trip.
Yes. Now, we had an expectation that we might be able to convince the Iranians to exercise their influence at the time of the meeting or shortly thereafter to gain the release of the hostages. But I knew of no plan for a simultaneous release of the hostages, simultaneous with the meeting.
What do you know, Mr. Secord, about what actually occurred in Tehran?
Well, what I've read in the Tower report and what I was debriefed on by several of the participants when they returned to Israel, I was in communications with the delegation via a special communication system, but I was not privy to their conversations with Washington. So I had to rely on debriefing when they returned for my information.
Were you actually asked to do something while you were in Tel Aviv and they were in Tehran?
Two things.
Tell us both.
One was to be ready to deliver the other 12 pallets of IHawk spare parts, and I had a second airplane set up for that, and I was actually told to launch it on, I think, the 27th of May, and we did launch it under positive control, and then after about 4 hours I was told to order the plane to return to base, and I did just that.
So the plane containing the rest of the Hawk spare parts actually took off, started in flight towards Tehran, and you were instructed while it was in the air to have it returned.
That is correct. And that was part of the plan. This was not an offhand thing. We had anticipated doing something like this. Secondly, I had been asked by North sometime just before this mission to support the DEA people in another attempt to locate and perhaps rescue some of the hostages in Lebanon. They were working out of Cyprus, and they picked up some money, which I asked Mr. Hakim to arrange to support their expenses. They actually picked it up themselves in Geneva. And this little operation was going on at the same time. It was a little bit confusing for me. And in fact, after I heard of some curious things about this Cyprus operation, one of which was they wanted my ship to go down and stand offshore to be used in some operation to pick up the hostages. I've got in touch with Mr. Tom Kleins and dispatched him to Cyprus to join up with the DEA agents and try to find out what was going on. I have a lot of faith in Kleins' ability as an intelligence officer and his operational judgment. So he did go there. He assessed the operation and notified me that he gave it no more. Initially he said 40% chance, then later 20% chance of success, and it did not succeed. So those were the two things I was asked to do.
What was the final outcome of this meeting?
The Tehran meeting failed. It stuck on the issue of the failure of the Iranians to arrange for the release of the American hostages, and the McFarland mission broke off after some discussions with high-ranking members of the government. They did go through some discussions there. They did present points. They went down that road, but after a few days and the hostages were not released, they aborted the mission and returned.
Did they return to Tel Aviv?
They returned to Tel Aviv, and then immediately the bulk of the party traveled onward to Washington.
Did you have any brief conversations with Mr. McFarland and his party before they traveled on?
Yes, I had a brief conversation with McFarland himself. He was very disappointed, and of course, so were we all. And I also had a brief conversation with Oliver North, but they were in a hurry to get on home.
How about Mr. Neer?
Mr. Neer, I talked with a lot. He was bitterly disappointed at the outcome. He felt that it hadn't been handled correctly. He felt they should have stayed longer. Thought they were making progress. Thought that the Iranians that was fair to give the Iranians more time because the Iranians were disorganized. Ghorbanifr's preparations had been inadequate, and so on.
Mr. Secord, simultaneous with the Hawk spare part transaction, was there a transaction involving tows?
Yes.
And did this relate to the 508 tows, or however many tows it was, that the Israelis had claimed they had been promised replenishment for?
Yes, the Israelis were demanding their tows back. Time had gone on, and they were unhappy. So it was decided that we would take the 822,000 that had been set aside, and the Israelis would add whatever was required to that sum to procure the 508 tows, and we shipped them to Tel Aviv at the same time as, in a separate airplane, but at the same time as we shipped the IHawk spares.
Was that also in a Southern Air Transport plane?
Yes.
You paid the expenses?
I paid it.
And how much additional money did the Israelis contribute at that time to the purchase price of the 508 tows?
They contributed what amounted to $1.4 million.
And you added that to the 822 that you had set aside and paid
Yes.
that to the U.S. Treasury, is that correct?
And that, yes, paid that to the U.S. Treasury.
Now,
That's not correct. I paid it to, I'm sorry, I didn't pay it to the U.S. Treasury. I paid it to the CIA account.
and to your knowledge, it went from there into the U.S. Treasury eventually?
I think I went to the Pentagon.
Mr. Secord, in May, when Mr. McFarland returned from Tehran, I take it Lake Resources has been paid $15 million for the Hawk spare parts. Almost all of the Hawk spare parts remain in Tel Aviv. The hostages have not been released. What is the status of the arrangement involving the Hawk spare parts and the hostages at that time?
Well, we were back in limbo again. We were, from my point of view, in a state of considerable confusion because we had been ordered not to deliver the balance of the spare parts, so they stayed in Israel.
Who ordered you not to do that?
McFarland and North.
Now, the spare parts had been paid for.
They had been paid for, and this was a source of a little bit of concern because Ghorbanifr and the Iranians were demanding that their goods be delivered. They'd paid for them, they want them delivered.
Well, why were you ordered not to deliver them if they had been paid for?
Because it was judged that the Iranians had not acted in good faith and that the meeting had been a failure. Therefore, then they didn't want to continue the initiative. The initiative was being reviewed with consideration being given to canceling it.
Well, what was it that the Iranians had not done?
They had not simultaneously released the American hostages, and therefore it was decided that the spare parts would not be delivered.
Now, I want to stay with this transaction just for a moment. Was that issue eventually resolved?
It was, but it took a long time.
How was it eventually resolved?
Ghorbanifr eventually resolved it through discussions and meetings with Near and with North, and also, I believe, with the CIA representative. and it resulted eventually in agreement to deliver the balance of the spare parts after one hostage was released, and the one hostage was released in late July. And the parts were finally delivered then in early August.
These are the bulk of the IHawk spare parts that
The 12 pallets, yes.
that had been delivered to Tel Aviv in May.
Yeah, that's correct.
And they were delivered after the hostage had been released.
That's correct. But up until that time, we were in some financial jeopardy, as you can imagine. We might have had to return a great deal of money.
I take it a certain amount of that money had been spent on the Contras.
Yes.
Now, back to the money. Did an issue arise relating to a price list sometime after Mr.
Yes.
McFarland's visit to Tehran?
Yeah, this further complicated our lives after the Tehran mission, because the Iranians were complaining to Ghorbanifar not only that their goods had not been delivered, but they claimed to have a price listing which showed that the prices that the price they had been charged was greatly inflated and unfair. This was bringing a lot of pressure down on Ghorbanifr's head. And so eventually we got this listing, which they called a microfiche listing. It turned out to be a valid listing, but it was a cost of manufacture listing, which is my understanding of it was that it was a list of prices that the prime contractor could expect from various vendors. And so it did not really relate to the price that even the Pentagon pays. It was not a valid list. But nonetheless, they raised a good deal of turbulence over this matter.
I take it that the list showed that the price for these Hawk spare parts was considerably lower than the price that they had actually paid.
That's right.
And
but it was not a valid list of the actual prices.
But the fact of the matter is the price charged was considerably higher than a true price list would have shown.
Yes.
And the price list, did you ever see it?
I don't recall ever seeing it. It was described to me, but I don't recall ever seeing it.
Do you know whether it was sent to U.S. government officials?
It was, yes. It was sent to North's office.
During this same period of time, did you learn anything that gave you concern about your ability to keep this project secret?
Yes. It seemed like everything bad was happening in this time frame. I learned after the Tehran meeting that Ghorbanifar claimed that he was dealing with financiers, and he named Saudi Adnan Khashoggi as being one of his financiers, and that he was not dealing with Iranian money. He was bridging with the borrowed money, and had been doing so all along. Apparently the Israelis knew this. I did not know it.
I take it the point here is, Mr. Secor, that he has borrowed money to put into Lake resources, and he can't repay that money until the goods are shipped to Iran and Iran pays him.
This was his claim.
And he claimed that he borrowed from Mr. Khashoggi and someone else.
Well, first it was just Khashoggi that I learned of, and then I learned that there were two Canadian businessmen behind Khashoggi, or at least this was another claim. I'm not sure that that was true, but this was the information we were receiving, and that this was a matter of additional concern yet. And then finally we were told that these people were going to go public, maybe even sue. They in fact did, through an intermediary, contact the director of CIA about this problem, and so it was unraveling.
I take it the problem was that he had deposited $15 million in Lake Resources, and because the Hawk spare parts had not been shipped, he was unable to repay the financiers.
That's correct.
Now, and they were putting pressure on him, and he was complaining to various people, Mr. Neer, Mr. North among them.
That's right.
And was that problem resolved when the Hawk spare parts were finally shipped?
I don't think the the problem was ever resolved.
Well, isn't it a fact that it was not resolved because you learned that Mr. Ghorbanifar said, given the price list, Iran was unwilling to pay the full $15 million?
This was his story, but we were never able to confirm this story, and the CIA people had serious reservations about that claim.
But that was his claim.
That was his claim.
And he was claiming, therefore, that even after the Hawk spare parts had been shipped, that he was unable to repay his financiers and that they were putting increasing pressure on him to do so.
That is what he said.
And then I take it you learned from a different source that these financiers were in fact complaining that they had not been paid.
Yes, I learned from North that they, and later from George Cave, that they had approached the director of CIA, and then two CIA employees met with the intermediary.
And approximately when was that?
I don't have that date, but I think it was probably in August or September.
Could it have been as late as October?
Sure, could have been. It was late, it was toward the end of this saga.
And was it at that point in time that you learned that they were threatening to sue?
No, that was brought up earlier. That Ghorbanifar had mentioned this to Near, who had mentioned it to North and I. And then
In any event, at some point in time, you learned they were threatening to sue.
Yes.
Did you learn that they had threatened to reveal the fact that some of the proceeds of this money had gone to the Contras and that that's why they hadn't been repaid?
I don't recall that arising at the time, but later I heard, of course, that they had said this, but I don't recall it being brought to my attention at the time.
Have you, by reviewing the committee's records relating to these Swiss bank accounts, Lake Resources and others, made a computation of the surplus on the Hawk spare parts transaction that you've just been testifying about?
Yeah, we've made an approximate computation, and
All right, let's start with the money received into the Lake Resources bank account.
recall that we had to procure 508 tows as well as the IHawks, and so the total money in was about $16.5 million.
That's 15 from Ghorbanifar
And the balance
$1.5
from Israel.
million from Israel, approximately.
Yes, approximately.
And how much to the
6.5 of that was paid immediately to a CIA account. We've computed from those records of Mr. Hakim that about
that's leaving a difference of approximately 10 million?
yes. And then the expenses for the various transportation and related activities, we computed to be about 1.7 million.
That leaves 8.3.
Yes, and then we, as I said, reserved, actually put in a certificate of deposit and an additional $2 million for hull insurance, which leaves 6.5 of surplus at that time, plus $4 million in certificates of deposit for insurance.
Now, why did you have to add $2 million self-insurance at that time?
Because we had to use 2 airplanes instead of 1.
And you had already set aside $2 million from the earlier transaction, so there was an additional requirement of one further amount equal to $2 million.
That's correct.
So,
May I suggest that we stop the interrogation at this point? The hearing will stand in recess until 2 o'clock this afternoon.